Welcome to Sinister Stories, where the shadows hold more than just secrets. If you're a fan of the dark and the twisted, you're in the right place. Tonight, we dive into a tale that will send chills down your spine. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss a single spine-tingling story. When I signed up to drive the overnight bus between Dallas and Houston, I thought the biggest challenge would be staying awake for the 3.5-hour route each way. Turns out I was wrong. My name's Devin, and I've been driving this route for about 3 months now. What I didn't realize was that the quiet of the highway at night hides more than just tired truckers and stray deer. The first time it happened, I brushed it off. It was around 2 a.m., and we were somewhere on Interstate 45. Most of the passengers were asleep, their heads lolling against the windows or slumped over in their seats. The bus was quiet except for the hum of the engine and the occasional snore. I was focused on the road ahead when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. At first, I thought it was a shadow cast by one of the overhead lights, but when I looked again, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the road. It was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a long trench coat or cloak. Its face was obscured in shadow, but the way it stood perfectly still sent a chill down my spine. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself I was imagining things, probably just tired. After all, the graveyard shift does things to your mind. But then, as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw it again. This time, it wasn't on the side of the road. It was standing inside the bus, halfway down the aisle. I slammed on the brakes, sending the passengers lurching forward. One guy cursed loudly. Another groaned as he rubbed his head. "What the hell, man?" someone shouted from the back. I turned around, heart pounding. The aisle was empty. "Sorry," I mumbled. "Thought I saw something in the road." The passengers grumbled, but eventually they settled back into their seats. I forced myself to keep driving, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see that figure again, but it didn't appear for the rest of the trip. When I reached Houston and dropped everyone off, I checked the bus thoroughly before starting the return trip. Empty. No sign of anyone or anything that shouldn't have been there. I chalked it up to exhaustion and promised myself I'd get more sleep before my next shift. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next night I was more prepared, or so I thought. I had loaded up on coffee and even brought along an audiobook to keep me sharp. The first half of the trip from Dallas to Houston was uneventful. The passengers were the usual mix. A tired family heading home, a couple of business people tapping away on their laptops, and a guy in a hoodie who immediately fell asleep. The weirdness started on the way back to Dallas. It was just past midnight, and the highway stretched endlessly ahead of me, illuminated only by the bus's headlights. The passengers were quiet, most of them either asleep or lost in their own worlds. I was starting to relax when I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced at the rearview mirror. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just rows of empty seats and the slouched forms of the passengers. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed someone sitting in the very last row. A man in a dark trench coat, his face hidden by the collar and the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. The problem? I hadn't picked him up. My stomach sank. I kept one hand on the wheel as I reached for the mic connected to the PA system. Excuse me, sir. Back there in the coat. Do you have a ticket?" No response. The other passengers stirred, looking around in confusion. "Sir?" I repeated, my voice trembling. One of the passengers, a woman sitting halfway down the aisle, looked back and frowned. "There's no one back there," she said. I looked again. The trench-coated man was gone. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel. "Sorry, must have been seeing things." The passengers didn't seem too bothered. Most of them shrugged it off and went back to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. An hour later, just as we were approaching a rest stop, I saw it again. A figure darting across the road in front of the bus. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. This time I didn't just see it. I heard it. A loud, sharp knock, like someone rapping on the windshield. The bus came to a screeching halt, and the passengers jolted awake. "What's going on?" the guy in the hoodie shouted. I didn't answer. My eyes were locked on the windshield, where a handprint was smeared across the glass. The print was too large to be human, the fingers elongated and claw-like. I threw the bus into gear and sped off, my pulse pounding in my ears. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to give it a chance to catch up. When we finally reached Dallas, I parked the bus and sat there for a long time, trying to catch my breath. The passengers disembarked, oblivious to the terror I had just experienced. As the last person stepped off, I looked back at the windshield. The handprint was gone, but I knew what I saw and I knew it wasn't over. By the third night, I wasn't sure if I was losing my mind or if something truly unexplainable was happening on my route. Part of me wanted to call it quits, but the other part, the part that loved the freedom of the open road, wasn't ready to give up. I told myself I'd just be extra vigilant. The ride to Houston was calm, the usual passengers, the usual stops. I even started to convince myself that the last 2 nights had been my imagination. But as soon as I turned the bus around and began the return trip, the unease set in again. It started with the windows. We were halfway back to Dallas, the highway stretching through an empty expanse of trees, when I noticed the windows fogging up. The AC was running fine, so it didn't make sense. I glanced back at the passengers, but none of them seemed to notice. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something smear across the glass. A face. It wasn't a reflection. It was pressed against the outside of the window, pale and ghostly, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a scream. It slid along the length of the bus, as though running alongside us. I jerked the wheel, the bus swerving slightly. The woman in the front row yelped, "What are you doing?" "Sorry," I stammered. "Thought I hit something." She muttered something about reckless drivers and turned back to her book, but I couldn't focus. The face was gone, but the windows remained fogged, streaked with faint handprints that hadn't been there before. I drove on, my hands shaking, my eyes darting from the road to the mirrors and back again. And that's when I saw them. Figures, standing along the side of the road. At first they were scattered, just 1 or 2, barely visible in the dim light. But as we kept driving, more of them appeared. They lined the highway like mourners at a funeral, their faces hidden by the shadows of their trench coats and hats. None of them moved. They just stood there, watching. I gritted my teeth and kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look in the mirrors. But it didn't matter. I could feel their stares, cold and unrelenting, boring into me. The rest of the trip was a blur. By the time we reached Dallas, I was drenched in sweat, my knuckles aching from gripping the wheel so tightly. As the passengers disembarked, I waited for someone to comment on the figures, or the faces in the windows, but no one said a word. When the last passenger stepped off, I stood and walked down the aisle, checking the seats. Everything looked normal, but when I reached the back of the bus, I froze. A hat sat on the last seat, wide-brimmed, black, and dusted with what looked like ash. I didn't touch it. I just backed away, heart pounding, and locked the bus. I told myself I'd report it to maintenance in the morning, but deep down, I knew the hat wouldn't be there when they checked. And I was right. The night after finding the hat, I was tempted to call in sick, but something about this job kept pulling me back. Maybe it was the quiet thrill of the road at night, or the sense of responsibility I felt for my passengers. Either way, I found myself behind the wheel again, preparing for another trip from Dallas to Houston. I had convinced myself that I wouldn't see anything unusual this time. It was just paranoia, I told myself. But the moment the bus pulled away from the station, I felt it, the same oppressive weight in the air. This time it didn't take long for things to start. About an hour into the trip, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a woman sitting in the aisle seat near the middle of the bus. She wasn't there when we left Dallas. Her hair was long and black, and she was dressed in an old-fashioned gown that looked out of place in the modern world. She sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Ma'am," I said into the mic, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you have a ticket?" She didn't respond. "Ma'am?" The passengers shifted in their seats, looking around in confusion. "There's no one there," the guy in the hoodie muttered, but I could see her, clear as day. I pulled the bus over to the side of the road and stood up, my heart pounding. "Everyone stay seated," I said as I made my way down the aisle. When I reached the row where she was sitting, I froze. The seat was empty, but the air was cold. So cold that my breath came out in visible puffs, even though the heater was running. I backed away, shaking, and returned to my seat. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was still there, watching me. When we arrived in Houston, I waited until the passengers were off the bus before checking the seats again. This time I found something even stranger, a single long strand of black hair draped across the armrest. By the time I reached Dallas again, I wasn't sure what I believed anymore. The unsettling presence of the woman, the cold strand of hair on the seat, and the eerie message on the window all combined into a terrifying reality that I couldn't explain away. But despite it all, I continued with the job. Maybe out of stubbornness, maybe out of a desperate need for answers. That night, I was determined to finish the shift and not let whatever was happening get to me. But the road had other plans. The trip to Houston was quiet, but as soon as I began the return drive, the weirdness kicked in again. The fog started on the windows, just like the night before, and I could see the figures standing by the side of the highway. Those shadowy, trench-coated figures, their faces hidden, watching the bus as I passed. This time, though, they weren't just standing there. They began to move. I noticed them out of the corner of my eye at first, one figure stepping forward into the road like it was about to cross. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. No figure, no shadow. Just the road stretching out before me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I pressed on, telling myself it was nothing, just fatigue playing tricks on me. But the weirdness kept building. The next stop was just past a small town on the outskirts of nowhere. A few passengers got off, and new ones climbed on. The bus wasn't empty, but it felt emptier somehow. It felt like the air itself had thickened, and every breath I took seemed labored. That's when I saw it. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, I saw the woman again, the one from earlier in the week. She was sitting at the back of the bus now, still in that old-fashioned gown, her eyes locked on mine in the mirror. I turned the wheel hard, jerking the bus into a slight swerve. The woman didn't flinch, didn't even blink. I pulled over and immediately stood up. "Ma'am, can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaky. This time no one reacted. The passengers in the front didn't even seem to notice her. But I knew she was there. The presence was overwhelming. I walked down the aisle, my steps slow, cautious, as if I were walking into some kind of trap. I reached her row, but when I got there, the seat was empty. No cold air, no hair on the armrest. Just the quiet hum of the bus's engine and the rustling of paper as one of the passengers flipped through a magazine. I backed away from the row, my heart racing. I returned to the driver's seat, hands clammy and gripping the wheel. I couldn't focus. Every reflection in the mirror seemed wrong, distorted, like something in the glass was waiting to pull me into it. The road stretched on before me, but nothing felt real anymore. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Another figure standing by the side of the road. This one was different. It wasn't wearing a trench coat. It was a man, but his body seemed to distort and twist, his face obscured by some kind of shifting darkness. I didn't dare take my eyes off the road. My grip tightened on the wheel, knuckles turning white. I had no idea how long the figure had been there, but as the bus moved past, I could feel something following us, something that didn't belong on this earth. When I looked at the passengers, I saw a strange sight. They were all staring ahead, unmoving. Not a single one blinked. They were as still as statues, as if they weren't real people at all. A creeping dread seeped into my bones. This wasn't just a haunting. It felt like I was driving through a world that didn't quite exist, a place where the laws of reality had been twisted and bent. The rest of the trip was a blur, my mind swimming with paranoia and fear. I just wanted to get to Dallas, to get back to safety, but I knew that wasn't enough. There was something wrong here, something waiting for me on the road. When I finally pulled into the station, I parked the bus and just sat there, staring out at the empty road. I couldn't bring myself to move. Was this job worth it anymore? Was my sanity? I don't know what's out there on that highway or who or what the passengers really are. All I know is that every night I'm still behind the wheel, but the road never seems to end. The road was endless, but I had to keep driving. That's the strange thing about this job. No matter how many times I think I'm done with it, I always return. Maybe it's the money, maybe it's the routine, but something keeps me going back to that cursed stretch of highway between Dallas and Houston. I was ready for it to be another normal night. I convinced myself that last week's strange happenings were just a combination of exhaustion and stress. But no sooner had I picked up my first passenger in Dallas than I felt the weight of it all pressing on me again. The ride was uneventful for the first hour. No figures lurking on the side of the road, no strange passengers appearing out of nowhere, just the hum of the engine and the soft chatter of passengers. But around the halfway point, things took a turn. I saw him in my rearview mirror. A man in a trench coat, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat, standing at the side of the road. He wasn't there a second ago, but there he was now, just standing. I looked away quickly, trying to shake off the sudden sense of dread that crawled over me. But when I glanced in the mirror again, the man was closer. I slammed on the brakes, swerving the bus. "Everyone stay in your seats!" I shouted, my voice frantic. I barely even realized I was yelling. I quickly pulled over to the shoulder of the highway, the tires screeching in protest. My heart raced in my chest as I scanned the rearview mirror. The man was gone. I stood up from the driver's seat and walked down the aisle. "Is everyone okay?" The passengers looked at me as if nothing had happened. The same faces, the same disinterested expressions. But something wasn't right. I could feel it in my bones. Then I noticed her. She was sitting in the same seat near the back of the bus. The woman in the old-fashioned gown, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes locked on mine. This time she didn't just sit there. She stood up slowly, her gaze never leaving me. She didn't walk. She floated toward the front of the bus, her feet hovering just above the floor. The bus was deathly quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the engine. As she came closer, I tried to speak, to ask her what she wanted, but the words wouldn't come. When she reached the aisle, she stopped right in front of me. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids. I couldn't see the bottom of them, like they went on forever. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Just the sensation of something pressing against my chest, squeezing the breath out of me. I couldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished. I stumbled back, gasping for air. The passengers were still staring straight ahead, unfazed. It was like they didn't even see her. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel and started driving again. I couldn't take my eyes off the road now, terrified that if I looked away for even a second, I might see something worse. And then, as if things couldn't get worse, I saw it. In the distance, on the side of the road, I saw the same trench-coated man again. He was standing still, facing the bus, and he wasn't alone. There were more of them, dozens of them, standing perfectly still, watching as the bus approached. I couldn't stop the bus. My foot was frozen on the gas pedal, and the closer I got, the more their faces seemed to shift and blur, as if they were becoming something else, something worse. I forced myself to look away, focusing only on the road ahead. But in my peripheral vision, I saw them moving, shifting, closing in. And then, in one blink, I was through them. The figures were gone, just like that. But I didn't feel safe. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The bus was empty. No passengers, no woman in the gown, no man in the trench coat. Just the empty road behind me, stretching on forever. By now I had to admit it. Whatever was happening on this route, it wasn't just some strange, bad dream. I wasn't just seeing things. There was something wrong. Something far worse than I could have imagined. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't just quit my job. I had to finish the shift, even if it meant facing the unknown again and again. But tonight felt different. There was an oppressive weight in the air, like the very atmosphere was pushing down on me. It had been a while since I'd seen the woman in the gown or the trench-coated figures, but tonight, I knew, deep down, that they would be waiting for me. I left the station in Houston at exactly midnight, the usual start time for my return trip to Dallas. The passengers were quiet, just like always. No one talked much on these night runs. Everyone kept to themselves, maybe out of fear, maybe out of habit. As I drove down the highway, I felt that same tension rise in my chest. The night was still and quiet, the stars barely visible through the heavy clouds. But as I looked into the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my heart stop. In the reflection, I saw the woman again, standing at the back of the bus. But this time, she was different. Her face was twisted, stretched like something grotesque, her eyes now wide and glowing, the skin on her face rippling like a shadow in a storm. I couldn't look away. I couldn't even breathe. I tried to turn my head to check if she was really there, but as soon as I did, she was gone. It felt like I had been holding my breath for an eternity. I looked at the passengers. They were still sitting quietly in their seats, oblivious. But I knew they weren't real. None of them were. They couldn't be. I pressed on, my hands clammy on the steering wheel, my eyes darting to the mirrors every few seconds. And then just ahead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The trench-coated figures standing along the side of the road. But this time, there were more than ever. Hundreds of them, standing perfectly still, their dark silhouettes stretching toward the sky like trees with no leaves. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to look at them any longer. But my eyes were drawn to them, unable to break free from their haunting gaze. The bus swerved as I fought to keep control. I couldn't let myself be swallowed by whatever nightmare I was in. Suddenly, one of the figures moved. It stepped forward right into the road, as if daring me to hit it. I slammed my foot down on the brake, the tires screeching in protest. But just like before, the figure disappeared the moment I passed. I continued driving, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get to Dallas. I had to finish this. The rest of the trip was a blur of headlights and dark shadows, the figures seeming to move in and out of the edges of my vision. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Finally, I arrived back at the Dallas station, the bus rolling to a halt. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely turn off the engine. When I stepped off the bus, I looked around. The station was empty. It was as if the entire world had fallen silent. No passengers, no staff, just the echo of my own footsteps. I felt something behind me, something cold and oppressive. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing. No figures, no woman in the gown, no strange passengers staring at me from the shadows. I thought I had escaped. I thought the nightmare was over. But as I walked toward the station doors, I glanced in the reflection of the glass. In the reflection, I saw a figure standing behind me. It was the woman, and she was smiling,